Welcome to the podcast of the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. My name's Jonathan Dallymore, and this is episode 4 of season 1 of our new podcast initiative. In today's episode, I sat down with Dr. Jo Hawkins from the University of Western Australia to discuss her new book, Consuming Anzac, The History of Australia's Most Powerful Brand. Essentially, this is a study of the relationship between consumer society and culture in Australia and the Anzac tradition as it is played out over the last century. In the interview, I was able to ask Jo a number of questions, including how she came up with the idea, how she researched the book, and also some of the specific claims that she makes throughout the different chapters. Obviously, we didn't have enough time to go into all of the detail that she brings out in the book, so I would encourage you to go and buy a copy of this. It is a fascinating read, and also I think a very valuable addition to the growing literature on Anzac in Australian politics and culture. If you haven't done so already, please check out our other episodes on iTunes and SoundCloud. And without further interruption, here's the interview with Dr. Jo Hawkins. Jo Hawkins, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
We're here to talk about your new book, Consuming Anzac, but what I thought we might do is actually start by talking about yourself a little bit. I'm interested in your story as a scholar. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, of course, I didn't start off studying history. I studied marketing originally. I always loved history, but I don't think I was I was a country kid. I didn't know anybody who'd ever studied an arts degree. I didn't know too many people who'd probably gone to uni. And so it just seemed to stretch too far. So I did a commerce degree. It seemed very sensible at the time. I started working in the advertising industry and I absolutely loved it. But in the back of my mind was always this love of history. And funnily enough, I think it was military history that was always a favourite topic and something I used to return to.
That actually answers a lot of my own questions about the book, so that's a good start. And as a historian, so you've made that move from one sort of field to another. What would you consider some of the most important influences on you as a historian?
Oh, wow. I mean, it was a whole new world going back to uni. I went back to uni in my late 20s part-time while I was still doing some marketing consulting because I really wanted to activate that more creative and intellectual part of me. I kind of had this longing to learn a little bit more about history, and I was actually so surprised by what I found. It was a whole new world, and the ideas that I started to get exposed to changed the way my relationship with the world and how I understood things. It's incredibly transformative and powerful, a history degree. And so I think scholars who talked a lot about nationalism, Eric Hobsbawm and Benedict Anderson, this idea of nations as social constructs, for me, that was just absolutely mind-blowing. I'd never been exposed to any thought like this. Even Edward Said ideas about race and Orientalism, those were quite influential, I think, when I was doing my undergrad, but also my honours. It was a real, it kind of changed my life, really, doing a history degree. It was amazing. And so then I was committed.
That's a great ad for a history degree if we ever did need one. Can we switch now a little bit towards the book? And I'm interested as well to ask you, how did you actually develop the idea for Consuming Anzac?
Oh, I think that happened over several years working in advertising, and also, I always had this interest in military history, of course, but it was very much, I think, the type of military history that I probably critique and explore within the book. It was very romantic and sentimental, and I very much enjoyed it. And I think that was probably one of the factors that led me back into kind of more formal, education around history. However, combined with my past experience in advertising, and all of a sudden I start learning about nations as social constructs and all of this incredible information that's allowing me to kind of unpick past experiences, I think that all kind of mashed together. So really, while I did my undergraduate degree, I think that's when these questions and themes started coming up. Because, and really, it occurred to me during my undergraduate degree how much historians and advertising executives have in common, because really it boils down to these incredibly intensely powerful stories that we tell each other en masse and that are really motivating and that can connect and drive the activity of millions and millions of people.
Were you at all worried in sort of researching and beginning to write the book about the potential criticism here? I mean, I don't read it as an anti-Anzac book or anything like that in any way, but I just wonder if you were sort of aware of the possibility of that and whether that worried you at all, or you just sort of steamed ahead with the research.
I did. I certainly steamed ahead with the research anyway. But I did think during my PhD in particular, especially as a woman online as well, I expected to get more, cop a bit more flack, really. But then I worked out why I wasn't. And of course, and I don't think I am really a culture warrior. Like I enjoy the Anzac story, and I still enjoy learning about military history as well. I think you're just coming at it from a different way. But the thing that I learned was that everybody hates the exploitation and commercialisation of Anzac, and this, there's nuances there, but basically, I think if you're on the left and you think that Australian history has become militarised, then you really don't like this activity either, because you think it's promoting this monocultural story. But actually, if you really enjoy the Anzac tradition, if it means a lot to you, and it means a lot to so many Australians, it's an intensely sometimes spiritual thing for people. It's very emotional, and that's important. And for those that large group of Australians for whom it means so much, they are also united in disdain for overtly commercial exploitation of the Anzac tradition, because of course for them, and there's always been this tension between consumer culture, which is seen as profane, and the Anzac tradition, which is seen as sacred. Of course, the boundaries between the two have always been messy. They've been messy for 100 years, and consumer culture does not necessarily sentimentalise or trivialise war memory. That's absolutely not the case. But the two groups are united, I think, when they feel that the boundaries have been crossed.
It's probably a good point to ask the question where you sort of see Consuming Anzac fitting into the wider scholarship about Anzac. I mean, it's no secret. I mean, it's actually a big part of your book that there is a lot of literature on this issue. So I wondered if you could maybe just sort of flesh out how you see Consuming Anzac as making a unique contribution here.
Yeah, when I started diving into this topic, I saw a couple of streams of thought. And so there was a group of historians who felt very strongly that the state had shaped this Anzac tradition, especially since the 1980s. They felt that state-sanctioned commemorations and investment into school curriculums and incredible, outlandish, even really, commemorative events and museums, etc., had promoted this myth and led to the militarisation of Australian history. And then there seemed to be another group who very much acknowledged the fact that the connections to the Anzac tradition were very, very personal, were ongoing, were almost of a religious kind of state-sanctioned religion, and that was valid as well. And actually, the truth is that both of those perspectives are very valid, and we see both of those operating. But for me, I could also see that there was this incredibly vibrant consumer culture that had performed an incredibly important role in producing and manufacturing memory, where especially after we lost that personal connection with the past. So in particular, after, say, the 1990s and 2000s, where we no longer, and my research was mainly looking at representations of the Gallipoli campaign, and it did focus on World War I rather than World War II. It's such a huge topic. But when we lost that lived connection with the past, when all of the veterans had passed away, there was a real anxiety in Australian society, and you can see that the production of memory amps up. And in a way, that has democratised access to the past. However, as I point out in the book, commercial world is not fueled by imperatives, by ideology. The commercial world doesn't care about your personal connections to the past in a, I guess, direct sense, but the consumer culture and the marketplace wants to make a profit. They want to deliver back to shareholders. And so there was this other logic, and I was fascinated by how that interplayed with both public sector and private sector, and then the community.
Can you just maybe summarize the basic thesis of your book? You're kind of already touching on that, I suppose, there, but maybe in a nutshell, what are you trying to argue here? So
essentially, I think the point I wanted to make is the commodification of Anzac isn't new. It started mere months after the landing. I found that absolutely astonishing. So it's not something new, but the ways in which the federal authorities and veterans organisations perceive the value of consumer culture and perceive the role of consumer culture associated with the Anzac tradition, that has changed drastically. So, for example, early in the 20th century, the federal government and veterans organisations were extremely strict about prohibiting any sort of commercialisation associated with the Anzac tradition. What happens after the Anzac resurgence, and especially after the 1990s, is I think there's a realisation that where memory does not exist anymore, it can be manufactured, and it should be manufactured. And I think after that point, there is really quite deliberate production of memory through commercial partnerships with veterans organisations and through tie-ins with extremely exuberant and lavish state-sanctioned commemorative events.
In the book, you kind of, it seems like you pick off several big fields of this mass consumption around Anzac. So like in chapter 3, you're discussing the publishing industry, and then in chapter 4, you look into the dawn service and spend actually quite a bit of time discussing tourism, particularly in Turkey, both of which I found very fascinating. Maybe we can just explore those one by one. What's the connection here between the book industry, the publishing industry, and the idea of Anzac?
Well, the publishing industry is so fascinating because for me, that's where I first see the first glimmers of the Anzac resurgence, because even in the late 1970s, Bean's histories began to be reprinted, and fictional books about the Great War, which were hugely popular at the time, like Ginger Mick, begin to be reprinted. So it's interesting in that sense. For me, the publishing industry has been brilliant at taking military history and transforming it from something that appealed to maybe your middle-aged white military history enthusiast, and whereby, I mean, really, before the 1980s, most books written about war described the Anzacs as these kind of heroic warriors, and really, but didn't focus on their lives per se, focused on tactics and strategy, and could be quite dense politically. And we see a change in storytelling around history in many ways, not just military history, and that's led by social historians of the 1970s, but soon permeates into the wider cultural sphere when we're talking about diggers' lives and experiences and emotions, and that's something that appeals to such a broader audience. And also the publishing industry is so innovative, in particular forms of narrative non-fiction. So when you're describing the past in a way that it feels like a fictional page turner, even a thriller, authors like Peter Fitzsimons have been incredibly successful writing books like that.
And to pick up the second theme, so tourism, you do spend quite a bit of time discussing that, which I actually found really fascinating because I wasn't really as aware of that perhaps as I was of the publishing material. So how in your view has that contributed to the story of Anzac as well?
The tourism was really fascinating and fun chapter to write. And I think a little bit because I look at the birth of tourism on Anzac Day at Gallipoli in particular. I just looked at Anzac Day and that Anzac Day spectacular because, of course, lots of people travel to Gallipoli all throughout the year. But I traced it back to Australian backpackers in Britain, especially from the 1980s. And I found this incredible this leisure culture in Britain, which was very nationalistic and lots of nationalistic songs and beer, and I see this leisure culture occur in Britain and then kind of transfer itself to Gallipoli. It was so interesting because I read issues of TNT magazine for about 30 years worth, but it was fascinating to see this journey start from a independent backpacking experience where there wasn't even, certainly there was no interpretation whatsoever. Indeed, there wasn't even transport. A backpacker who arrived in Gallipoli in the 80s would have to get a taxi down to the battleground, to this astonishingly controlled, tightly stage managed, spectacular, which we have today, which I think turns a lot of tourists off, actually.
I thought that was an interesting conclusion to that argument, actually, that its successes in some ways led to some kind of limitation on its popularity. I thought that was really interesting. And then, so the sort of later parts of the book, chapters 5 and 6, you then sort of broaden the scope of the argument out to look at some bigger connections, I think, between Anzac and consumer culture. So you look at the AFL Anzac clash, and then also bigger patterns of marketing and advertising, which, again, for me was quite a new way of looking at this. For the sake of time, we might skip over the AFL material and just focus in on this idea of marketing and advertising. From my reading of what you've argued there, it seems as though you were sort of making this point that Anzac and companies are kind of locked in this reciprocal relationship where they both benefit from each other. Have I got that right? And if not, maybe can you correct me?
No, that's right. And I think that's grown from the 2000s. Before the 1990s, I could find very few. I don't think I found very many at all examples of an advertiser evoking the Anzac tradition in their ads. It just the social currency associated with the Anzac tradition just didn't invite that kind of that type of thing, I think. But after the 1990s, advertisers start to evoke Anzac again because, of course, 1990 there was a big anniversary commemoration that Bob Hawke attended at Gallipoli, and I think that for me, and in the tourism chapter, I think for me that's a real turning point in Australian commemorative culture. That event was broadcast, to thousands of people back home on television, and it was a huge event. So after the 1990s, advertisers do think, this is interesting. I can associate my brand with this incredibly aspirational Australian national identity and this aspirational idea about masculinity. But it was really nostalgic. It was incredibly so, almost quite naive. And of course, the other really interesting thing about that era is that an advertiser didn't feel like they needed to ask permission to evoke Anzac. They would just do it. Even McDonald's in the mid-90s with this kind of commercial, which is one of my favourites of the era. It's unbelievably, and it gets me all the time, even though I'm very cynical about it. It still can make me quite emotional. Where you've got this veteran, I think at World War II, and he's sitting at the McDonald's restaurant. Drinking a coffee, and he's got all of his medals on, and he's obviously been to the parade, and he's obviously missing all of his mates who have passed away, and he's all by himself. And you get this young McDonald's kind of cafe worker, and she pours his coffee up, pours him another coffee, and he said, "How much is that, love?" And she said, "Oh, nothing, it's free." And he says, "Oh, thank you." And then she turns to him, and then there's this pause, and she says, "No, thank you." It's very cliched, and it's almost a bit camp, really, but it's still very emotional. But I think for me, that's it would never happen again now, because now what happened after the 2000s, when you get Aussie troops, servicemen and women, going back into Aussie servicemen men and women had never stopped serving overseas. But I think when we start having wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's a different type of involvement, and you do start having casualties as well. And there's an entirely different relationship between advertisers and Anzac after that point. And they're always will do some kind of collaboration with a veterans organisation after that. And it's called cause marketing. And that's when you align your brand with a charity. And usually a product purchase is linked to a donation to that charity. But it's very much a commercial arrangement, and they're incredibly profitable when they've done well. And the AFL have done it really well. Victoria Bitter Beer did it very well for a long time. Yeah, and there's lots of examples of that.
I must admit, I'm sort of now, after reading the book, my sort of senses are heightened and keeping an eye out for these sorts of things, but I haven't got any good examples to send you yet. You seem to have covered it all. Um, I'm also really interested in how you actually go about working on these broad cultural themes as a historian. So, I mean, when I look at, say, traditional military history, books are often concentrating on events and people and quite definable aspects of, say, a conflict. To me, without oversimplifying it, to me that seems reasonably clear as to how you would actually go about researching that. You compile the secondary literature, you then get into the archives, and then you start to sort of write it up. But this book, I mean, I'm one of the impressive parts about it is the extraordinary breadth at which you cover the material, but it also raises questions for me about how you actually just go about doing the research. How do you find the material when it's not just in one archive and so on? Can you maybe just discuss that a little bit for us?
Oh, yeah, that was an adventure. Absolutely. I think I was inspired by a historian called Jerome de Groot, who wrote a book called Consuming History. And his book was such a plethora of different examples of historical consumption that I think that gave me a little bit of confidence. Although he's an incredible writer and scholar, so it's the confidence up to a point, but you're like, could I do this? I think as a PhD candidate, you do lack confidence to be ambitious. I think I had a really supportive PhD supervisor who was like, "Yep, no, you can do this. This sounds legit. 100-year history of Anzac and consumer culture." But we narrowed it to Gallipoli campaign, and then we narrowed it to certain industries. But I love historians who are ambitious. They're my favourite historians to read. I think more of us should be and should try and undertake and synthesize these grand themes. I certainly don't think. I think my book is one example of it. A little, exploration of that. I don't know if you've read any of Yuval Harari's books, but he wrote *Sapiens*, which is a global phenomenon bestseller. But I mean, I just think he does it brilliantly. I love historians who can synthesize incredibly complex themes and theories for a public audience. But really, I think I just had a sort of supportive supervisor, but also I think maybe I get bored easily as well. I must admit, I loved working on every single chapter because there was so much that was new because you have to learn all about the publishing industry in this entire world, and then you're kind of delving into the advertising industry, which has an entire other bunch of kind of fields, and I'm kind of tapping into business literature and tourism literature, and it was a really enjoyable thesis to write, and then it was an enjoyable book to write, that's for sure.
I assume here that your background in marketing and other fields was a real asset in the process of this, because I'm reading the book and I'm sort of thinking, I'm glad you're defining some of these terms because I have no idea what they are.
Yeah, I think you're right. Your previous experience gives you so much, and I think many historians and even PhD candidates, I think the average age of a PhD candidate is mid to late 30s, so most of them have worked before in different industries and different contexts, and I think bringing that experience into your scholarship can only enrich it.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I do want to ask a couple of questions here that might push a little bit beyond the sort of content of the book. We've really only just scratched the surface of all of the detail that you actually get to mobilize in that book. But yeah, a couple of questions that maybe push beyond that. In recent months, we've basically seen another public argument explode regarding things like funding to Australia's cultural institutions. I'm thinking here about the recent debate about the money that's going towards the Australian War Memorial in Canberra at a time when some other institutions seemed like they're struggling. Do you make any connections here between the decisions about funding and the ideas in your book? And if not, how do we explain this kind of what people would call favoritism in the cultural institutions?
Yeah, well, I certainly do. And I think what I tried to do in the book is to define how Anzac has represented value over the last 100 years. So, it can be social currency, it can be actual economic value, and then define who has access to that value over the years, because of course some people are allowed to benefit from it and other people are not, and you kind of see that all the time, because essentially a lot of these collaborations have to be sanctioned by either a veterans organisation or the federal government. Look, I think there are definitely links to it. The War Memorial funding, for me, I just find very absurd the idea that arms manufacturers are sponsoring exhibitions there. I think I've heard it described as a cigarette company making a donation to a cancer ward. It seems for me to be beyond and kind of in contrast to the spirit in which that memorial was originally built. But I think it's a testament to the social currency still attached to the Anzac tradition, and the fact that these enormous global arms manufacturers believe that they can soften their reputations by being involved in it. And I feel like those relationships are being questioned more and more. I'd love to. We still haven't seen a public groundswell against it. I would hope that will stop, because I think that it's making a lot of people uncomfortable. And I think the group of people who might be able to influence are actually veterans, because veterans are getting more and more vocal about the commercialisation of the Anzac tradition, and which I think is only a good thing.
I know this is very, very well aware this is poor form, but asking you to think a little bit in the predictive mode for a second. And I mean, we hear a lot about this concept of peak Anzac, particularly 2018 is a very good year for this, in the sense that people are talking about, the end of the centenary and other things. But I got the impression from the concluding sort of parts of your book that you kind of think Anzac is actually here to stay as this dominant feature of our culture for at least the foreseeable future. Where do you see it going from here?
Anzac is incredibly malleable and dynamic. The ways in which it's expressed, the stories that are told, it changes a lot. The essence stays the same, that kind of connection to Australian national identity. But it is so heavily invested in by the federal government. They do not want it to go anywhere. There is intense efforts to socialise and continue the Anzac tradition. It does seem to continue and have this meaning. I do think it's important. I think it's important for Australians. However, it completely dominates other fascinating Australian stories. I think the attention that we pay to it is to the detriment of our society. I really believe that. It overshadows extraordinary stories of achievement in all kinds of cultural and political realms. But historians are kind of fighting back, and they're fighting back in the best way possible, which is with really awesome, fascinating stories, which are entertaining and moving and tell us about other aspects of our national identity. And I think Claire Wright is one example of a wonderful historian who writes great books, incredible page turners about things that you'd never, that other people haven't written about. So most recently, our Australian suffragettes and their global influence. I mean, how proud should we be of that?
Your example there is great. I was actually, as you were speaking, thinking of Claire Wright, and it seems like a very logical kind of place to finish up. So thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us, and I really wish you all the best for the book and your other work. Can you quickly tell us where to buy a copy of the book and maybe where to follow you on social media?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I think probably the easiest way to buy a copy would be online. So it's at Booktopia, and I think New South Books as well as a distributor. And you can also follow me online at History Punk, and it's history_punk.